So of a position that's of true importance, quarterbacks tend to be overvalued the most on a log-adjusted basis when it comes to the difference between expected and actual draft position.
Welcome to another episode of the Football Analytics Show. My name is Ed Fang, your host, and my guest today is Benjamin Robinson. He's been using mock draft data in order to predict the 2020 NFL Draft. Today, we get into whether the NFL Draft quote-unquote experts are more accurate in predicting the draft. We talk about the draft status of Tua Tagovailoa despite his injury, and Benjamin also gives us a surprise prediction for the 2020 NFL Draft. The Football Analytics Show is brought to you by the Power Rank. That is my site for better football predictions through data and analytics. If you sign up for my free email newsletter, you can get a look at my NFL pre-draft rankings. These come from the win totals over at FanDuel Sportsbook. And what I do is I take these win totals and I translate them into a rank and a rating for all 32 NFL teams. It's a way to get an assessment of each team heading into the draft and then to evaluate what kind of bump a team might get from who they've selected in the 2020 NFL Draft. So to get these pre-draft NFL rankings, go to thepowerrank.com/predictions. Joining me on the Football Analytics Show for this episode is Benjamin Robinson. He is the creator of grindingthemocks.com. He essentially takes data from mock drafts to predict the 2020 NFL Draft. Benjamin, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Ed.
Absolutely. Would love to know your story. How did you get into NFL data, putting together these mock drafts, and starting the website grindingthemocks.com?
I grew up in Cincinnati, so I grew up a Bengals fan, and the 1990s and the early 2000s as well were not always super kind to Bengals fans. When I think I started paying attention to the draft around when the Bengals drafted Carson Palmer, which was in 2003. Right. So, and a lot of fans, maybe, people, if you're from, you're from Michigan and the Lions fans, or if you're from Cleveland, the Browns fans, your team isn't always very good. So the draft is always a time of hope.
Right.
And because the NFL season is only, 17 weeks, it's a pretty small sample size. So the swing from year to year in win percentage, if you can get a good draft, get some really impactful players, you can improve your team. And so I was sitting on my friend's couch in Pittsburgh where I went to college, and we were watching the draft, and this was in 2018. This is the Baker Mayfield draft. And we're sitting there and we're watching our favorite analysts and on the TV. And, they said, I thought that was a reach, or, oh man, what a steal. And we were talking, and, I said to my friend, well, how do you know if that is legitimately, it might be correct. And a lot of conventional wisdom has some shred of truth in it. But how do we know it's actually correct? And so, the truth seeker in me, my econ background, my questioning data-driven background said, well, how do we answer this type of question? Is the draft pick a reach or not, or a steal or not? And you have to have, at some point, to make that kind of conjecture, you need to have a basis of expected. What's the expected outcome? And so I thought, well, how can we collect information about what an expected outcome for a player is? And I thought, well, I think mock drafts, there's a lot of them. People are putting a lot of them out there. They're supposed to be driven by a kind of expectation of what might happen. There's a lot of groupthink, so we'll have to see what goes on in there, and the bias that's involved in human decision-making that exists everywhere. But I think there might be something there. And I looked around like anybody who does like a literature review, and I didn't see anybody doing anything with it publicly. And so I decided to dig into it. And so the idea for grinding the mocks is that, the people who do a lot of draft analysis, they do a lot of qualitative, really, analysis. They watch game tape, preferably the All-22, and they make conjectures and projections about a player based on a sample of watching them play on tape. And they often call that grinding the tape. They call those people like tape grinders. Huh. And so I was like, well, I'm not doing that because, to be honest, I don't know that much more about football than the next guy, other than that I've read a couple of Chris Brown books. So, but when I'm watching the game, I don't necessarily know what I'm seeing better than anybody else, unless it's really obvious. like Joe Burrow, for example. Like, it's obvious that he was great. The data also shows he's great. Like, that's easy. But how do you determine that for other players? And so I don't really know what I'm looking at. And so I call it grinding the mocks, because I go and look through those mock drafts, and I take the information and the insights that people have put together based on their analysis of the film, or based on somebody else's analysis of the film, or whatnot, to make a decision about, what might happen at a certain position in the draft. So grinding the mocks comes out of those conversations and trying to take a discipline that I think is very qualitative and apply like a little bit of rigor to it from an analytical perspective, and can learn some interesting things about the draft process and the draft itself from these types of insights. So that was kind of what drove me to kind of start this grinding the mocks project.
Awesome. Yeah, I my interest in it is that you're using the wisdom of crowds. So we know that one mock draft is never going to be perfect, right? But when you combine a number of mock drafts, it has potentially the power to be very predictive. And that's what I like about your work. I mean, it's similar to the preseason polls in both college football and college basketball. A lot of people have shown that they are actually very good predictors of postseason performance. And the idea there is just put together that many opinions, and you get a pretty good estimate of team strength and team talent. And that persists throughout the whole season. So, Benjamin, tell us a little bit more about what you do at grindingthemocks.com. And in particular, let's focus on the pre-draft stuff, which is going to be the most useful now in terms of predicting expected draft position. You have 3 different models. Maybe you can just go through them for us in terms of how you're going to project what happens later this month.
So, yeah, I agree with you on the wisdom of crowds. I'm a big believer in the Philip Tetlock school of super forecasters. So that's right up my alley. The social science stuff on that is really, really interesting. I took this from a very kind of naive approach. And so my approach was, I don't know anything about what works, but as far as I can tell, there's not a lot of research about that tells us metrics are really good at predicting the draft. Let's just look at some basic measures of central tendency. So I started looking at the average, and I said, well, the average, if I collect data over a long period of time, the average can be misleading, because unless I collect a lot of data, averages on small samples don't tell me a lot. So I thought, well, okay, the most basic measure that I really want to have is a weighted average. And let's weight that average by how far away we are from the draft. And we do that on a kind of inverse linear basis, so that drafts that are happening now are weighted much smaller than drafts that happen, or mock drafts really, that happen the week of the draft or even the day leading up to the draft. That's when the models, the weights really kick in really high.
Sure.
And then let's also have a little weight for we'll call like prior mock draft accuracy. So what I look at is I look at the latest mock draft that I have in my data for folks, and I say, how accurate was it on a residual basis? So like the mean sum of square error, right? And so let's look at that, and let's add a kind of interaction term between the date that the mock draft was made and the accuracy of the people who make the mock draft. And let's look at that over time. And so the weighted average is kind of the basis of that. And then I said, well, we're looking at this change over time. Let's do some like very basic models. So there's a linear model that I incorporate, and then a Loess model, which is kind of a locally optimized kind of regression. So these are all basic regression estimates. And let's see what we can learn just from those basic measures alone. And that's what I'm sharing on the site, are just these kind of aggregated measures. And so I said, well, let's see how.
Wait, hold on. Let me stop you real quick, because when you're doing the regression, is your X variable like the time before the draft?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep,
so you're fitting a line.
Change over time.
Okay. And so that's the Loess regression that you're talking about. And I presume they're related, because for every player you have this, I mean, you look at how a curve basically fits the projections over time, right? Leading up to the draft.
Mm-hmm.
And then that is going to be, so that line is kind of your Loess regression estimate, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so what we do is at the end of the process, we want to say, hey, on the day of the draft, what does that look like? So you do like a small little projection from the data. And so to be honest, a lot of the mock drafts leading up to the day of the draft are pretty noisy. And so that's why I try to downweight them as much as possible, because, we're really not 100% sure about, and it's all about giving the opportunity for this draft marketplace, because the draft is really a marketplace. to have complete and public information as possible. And
Okay.
so oftentimes, for example, every year we get surprises. And some of those are because the data doesn't have a lot of time to react to information that comes out, for example, the night before the draft. So,
Right.
for example, in the 2018 draft, expected draft position for Baker Mayfield was 4th.
Right.
But leading into the day, there was rumors that were coming out, with strong sources saying the Browns are considering Baker Mayfield at 1. So when I'm sitting on the couch, I see that my mock draft data says Sam Darnold is going to be number 1 player.
Right.
But then my just basic common sense says, oh, well, the reports are saying Baker Mayfield. But yeah, it's all about giving the marketplace the opportunity to capture as complete information as possible.
Right.
And that's a little bit about what makes this year's draft kind of weird. Given the coronavirus, the teams don't have as complete information as they normally have in years past.
Right.
One could argue that some of that information can be biasing, given that people are much more likely to make judgments about someone based on in-person interactions or from people who they trust, and those interactions and those kind of judgments can be biased as well. But yeah, so the whole idea of this process is over time, let's let the priors build up. Let's see how much of that sticks, and let's weight certain information from certain people higher or lower than others to try to make the best kind of measure of central tendency that we can.
I wanted to ask you a little bit, because you look at each mock drafter in terms of their historical accuracy. I mean, obviously you can't do that much with this year because we haven't had the draft yet. How far back are you looking to get accuracy for every person that you're looking at in these mock drafts?
So right now it's just inside of my data. So the past 2 years. So it's mostly because people can change lengths on the internet. So I just want to be able to collect information that I know is accurate as of the time it was created.
Sure.
So I'm just looking back since 2018. And so, that's definitely a little bit of a hole in the methodology. But, over time, the longer I do this, the more accurate that those numbers will hopefully be. For example, there are mock draft contests that are held every year. So the Huddle Report holds a kind of mock draft contest, and they give people credit for picking the right position to the right team or the right player to the right team, but a different pick. And for me, I'm just very much interested in a player level result, not a team level result. And so my interest is, hey, let's just look at the range of expected outcomes for a player. And let's think about it from a player-centric level, not from a pick-centric level, not from a team-centric level, but from a player perspective. Let's look at it from the player and say, because we know, just like anything else, that there's a range of outcomes that could happen. If we did the draft, 10,000 times, we would expect, independently of each other, right, that there would be different outcomes each time. So we often think of the draft as a zero-sum game, like it happened or it didn't. But just like a player's expected outcomes for their career, it could be anything from, for example, for Joe Burrow, it could be anything from a kind of above average player to an elite player. We know that there's lots of variables and things that'll happen over the time that will affect his potential outcomes. And so we know that it's the same with the draft. We just don't think about it that way because the mock drafts are teaching us to think, oh, it's just about that one selection, not about, hey, let's look at the range of selections that a player might have. And and it gives us a better sense of what's going on with their draft stock, which, ultimately is kind of a fake thing when people talk about it without saying, hey, this is how I measure draft stock. So let's measure draft stock and see what we can learn from that.
Yeah, so I think what you're trying to say is with any one mock draft, you're looking at a player and how far off the mock draft was compared to where he actually got drafted.
Yeah,
Okay.
Exactly.
Excellent. Now, one thing I find interesting is that you make a distinction between expert versus fan versus media. How do you make that distinction?
So it's a pretty subjective definition. And I said, well, the reason I wanted to track that was because I wanted to see if the experts were really experts, or if potentially the fans had something to say, or maybe the media. And it turns out that the experts are really more accurate overall than everybody else. And then I think there's also an interesting social network dynamic going on in there. But to answer your question, it's pretty subjective. So for the most part, experts are people who I believe are really thought leaders in the field. Some of them work for media publications, so it's kind of confusing. Right. But, people pay attention to Todd McShay and Mel Kiper Jr. They pay attention to Matt Miller of Bleacher Report and Daniel Jeremiah of the NFL Network. Those are the thought leaders. Those are the experts. And then there's also people who have kind of participated in some of these, mock draft challenges and contests in the past who I know have good track records. So those are experts.
I was just going to say, like, I know someone like Evan Silva has had a pretty good track record over at Huddle.
Yeah, he's an expert, yeah.
So you consider him an expert?
I consider him an expert, even though he works for a publication. But for example, you're in Detroit, so, the Detroit Free Press or the Detroit News, I consider those to be media, like more traditional media.
Right.
And then the fans, you kind of bucket everybody into the fan designation for the most part. That's where most of the mock drafts come from.
Oh, interesting. Because I feel like with the media, you're essentially saying, all right, well, let's take a guy that doesn't necessarily cover the NFL draft all year, like a Todd McShay does, but we'll put him in the media because he or she writes for a media publication and it is actually his or her job to do a good job with this mock draft.
Yeah. So oftentimes, those people will be privy to, maybe they have relationships with people inside of an organization.
Right.
So, potentially, or they work, around the league and have good connections. It's a bit of a mix, but the idea is theoretically for them and maybe for other teams as well, they should have more of an insight into the actual state of the team, what their quote unquote needs are, and then who might best fit them from their perspective.
Right. And then fans are what? Anyone with a blog that can put up a mock draft.
Pretty much. That's pretty much everybody else. And so people have sometimes reached out to me and said, hey, I think this guy, is not really a fan. They're more of like a media guy. And I said, well, the idea is that if anything, the shift from one group to another is probably a very, very marginal benefit or detraction in one way or the other to media accuracy or to expert accuracy.
Right.
Just because the groups are big enough that if you add one more to them, they usually don't change that much.
So what is the breakdown? Like what % of the mock drafts are expert versus media versus fan?
I'd say more than half are fan mock drafts.
Okay.
And then I'd say maybe a quarter each of the media and the experts. And like I said earlier, I think there's an interesting social network that potentially goes on that I haven't really investigated a lot. It's kind of more of like an academic question of, who is the true thought leaders? Where do, players that get mocked in a certain way start, and does it kind of spread, kind of like in this time, like a disease? And we want to think of it more as a social network, right? So there's potentially, I think, a really interesting dynamic that goes on in there. And that's one of the things that I think about when I think about bias, because, you might not necessarily think a player is that good, but if, an expert or thought leader said this guy is someone who's being looked at by teams in this way, then you might change your mock draft stance because of it. It's just another piece of information. Whether it's accurate or not is a different story, but it's something else that adds, color to the draft process, the horse race process that kind of we're in right now, even though we're 17 days out from the draft.
You mentioned that experts were the best. Is the media better than the fans?
Yeah.
Great.
By a little bit, yeah.
Okay. I mean, you could probably run some analysis to see who in the media just copies the experts in terms of how similar their mock drafts are. That would be, I think, particularly interesting. Excellent. Well, let's talk about some of your results, and in particular, let's talk about the quarterback position, the most important guys coming out of this draft, just with the nature of this game. What does your data say about the quarterbacks? And let's start with Joe Burrow at the top, and then maybe talk about Tua Tagovailoa and some other guys.
So the quarterback position has been really interesting this year. We know quarterback is the most important position on the field, and it looked pretty set coming into the year that Justin Herbert and Tua Tagovailoa would be duking it out to be the first two quarterbacks taken. And then, we had this Joe Burrow season to, for the ages. He came, on really strong. And, the big curveball this year was the injury that Tua Tagovailoa sustained against Mississippi State that, people still, at least in the public, don't have the full knowledge or potentially of the actual injury or what the recovery has been like. Obviously there's medical privacy laws for that specifically, but so that's a huge curveball. And so, I actually did an article about a little blog post on my website that looked at kind of, can we make a more kind of causal kind of inference a little bit about what the true impact of his injury was, at least around the time that the injury happened, because people suddenly were saying, oh, he was going to be a top pick, and now we don't know if he's going to be in the first round. And so mock drafts really varied quite a bit, kind of a month before and then looking a month after his injury. But now he's kind of settled into the second quarterback, and Joe Burrow, has settled in number one. And so even before Tua's injury, Joe Burrow was kind of gaining on him in the standings when it comes to mock draft stock. Joe Burrow, number one, very solid right now. 1.1 expected draft position. It's about probably as small as it's going to get. And Tua in there solidly, number two, but there's still quite a bit of uncertainty with injury. And so, pretty much everybody has him as the third player. So I think there's a lot of people who are expecting, a trade because the third overall pick, belongs to the Detroit Lions. And you can make a case for them to select Tua, but I'm not sure if I see that happening. And then following him is Justin Herbert, who I think, lost the most, really, when Joe Burrow had his rise, because, Justin Herbert was considered one of those top few quarterbacks. And, you would think that if Tua was hurt, potentially he would be the one who would be maybe in a discussion for the top overall pick. But he had kind of the same season he had as a junior.
Right.
So that really doesn't move the needle much. So he's still a potential top 10 pick, but he's not a top 5 pick. And so, one could argue that with just focused on maximizing his expected draft position, he maybe should have come out last year. But that's besides the point.
Yeah.
So he's in this year's class. He's a quarterback 3, and he's still likely to be a top 10 player. QB4 is another of these quarterbacks that have questionable data, which is, in terms of production, which is Jordan Love from Utah State. So Jordan Love, statistically, when I think of players, I'm not going to make an exact comparison here, but in each of the last few drafts that I've been involved in tracking, these mock drafts, you had Josh Allen, who didn't really have a great statistical profile.
Right.
You had Daniel Jones and Drew Lock, who also didn't have great statistical profiles. They had maybe one strong year that gave you a sense of potential, but nothing that says, I think this guy is really going to outperform the projection in college, because we know that prior projection is a pretty good predictor of future production. Jordan Love, he's kind of viewed as one of these guys with great traits. So right now, expected draft position is kind of in the early 20s, mid-late first round. But, we'll see. The one thing that I've learned from observing quarterback position, specifically in the lens of mock drafts, is that mock drafts tend to overrate quarterbacks the most of any position, even in a small sample of the last 2 years of quarterbacks. It's like 25 quarterbacks that I have data on for the last two draft years that we're assessing this kind of overvalued proposition on. Quarterbacks are the most overvalued position outside of positions that I really have trouble predicting because of lack of data, which are, the specialist positions mostly.
Right.
So of a position that's of true importance, quarterbacks tend to be overvalued the most on a log-adjusted basis when it comes to the difference between expected and actual draft position.
Interesting.
So quarterbacks, I think that what happens is that they try to fit as many of them into the first round as possible. Okay. And then when one of them drops out or two of them drop out, it ends up kind of inflating. So last year, Drew Lock was somebody who I think a lot of people expected the Denver Broncos to take with their first round selection.
Right.
They didn't do that. They drafted Noah Fant, one of those tight ends from Iowa, but they ended up taking him in the second round. So when you do that in a longer, mock draft, it means that if you move a guy into the first round who might have been a second round pick, well, suddenly if you think that a team will want to get a quarterback in the second round, it suddenly kind of pushes everybody up kind of consecutively, especially the quarterback position, which we know is, one of the most important ones. And then, after the Jordan Love, the first round quarterbacks, some people have said they think there could be a fifth quarterback in the first round. And in my data, I just don't see it. There's nobody who's really trending upward right now. It wouldn't be surprising to me if there was. There's always surprises in the draft just because of the incomplete information that we have around player health or injuries. So, the two guys that are kind of in the next tier of guys that I think could be, if there was going to be a fifth, it would be Jacob Eason from Washington and Jalen Hurts from Oklahoma. Right. And so Jalen Hurts, had a kind of very, if you weren't paying attention to college football, he was a Heisman finalist. People forget about that. One of the, I think, along with Joe Burrow, probably two of the best quarterback seasons last year in college football. Right. So maybe if Burrow wasn't so awesome, we would appreciate the production that Hurts had more. Right. And so his stock rose quite a bit during the season, and then afterwards, people were like, "Oh, wait, I don't know about this." And so his stock is now in round 3. And so it's kind of interesting to see if he was going to be first-round pick, he wouldn't be, the biggest outlier that I had in terms of expected versus actual, but he'd be up there.
Yeah, I mean, Hurts, had an interesting season because he came out smoking hot, was doing great, but when things got tougher in the Big 12 season, his numbers weren't as good. And in fact, I thought it was interesting because Lincoln Riley was actually running him a lot, which to me tells me that he doesn't really trust him to throw against better secondaries. And I think you can see that in your data because, it's not like after the season where Hurts drops. It's actually November, December when he starts making the decline. So it's interesting to look at those guys at 4 and 5 in the quarterback position. I also really enjoyed looking at your data for Jake Fromm because he was considered a kind of a top first round pick at the beginning of the season. The Georgia quarterback has since slipped pretty drastically. I think he would maybe be the 6th quarterback in your analysis.
Yeah, definitely. It's an interesting story to follow. Coming into the year, very, very, very early mock drafts had him as kind of in the one of those top 3 quarterbacks. And then, I think his season wasn't really that spectacular. Georgia kind of is, they're making a play. They hired Todd Monken this offseason to kind of ingest some energy into their offense because, to be honest, they have all these great players. And you see some of the great players that are drafted on offense out of Georgia, both at the running back position, definitely on the offensive line. And then also at the wide receiver position, you saw this with Nicole Hardman last year and how Andy Reid used him versus how, the Bulldogs used him. To me, it's interesting, but it's been a kind of a steady drop ever since.
Yeah.
So right now, I view him in the kind of mid to late round 3. So it's interesting to follow because, I don't think people view him as kind of more of a above average quarterback than someone who can kind of take over and just and really move your offense in a totally different direction.
Right.
They don't view his arm strength as being very strong. But yeah, I think he's a solid player, and quarterback is a very valuable position, and you could probably do worse than him.
Yeah.
In the draft, for sure.
Well, I mean, he took over the starting job as a freshman, and they continued to give him more responsibility as the season went on, and he was pretty good by the time he got to that national championship game against Alabama. Had a really good sophomore year, but really fell off this year. I think from part of what I've read, it looked like they really had some issues at the receiver position. I don't know. It's an interesting thought experiment to see what would happen if you put Joe Burrow at Georgia and Jake Fromm at LSU. Put Fromm in a system where he's got an innovative offensive mind and a lot of NFL receivers around him, and put Burrow in a less good situation. I mean, Burrow was clearly fantastic this year, but from my perspective, like he's only really done it for one season. It was a spectacular season, but he wasn't particularly good before that. So I think it just points to all the uncertainty in all this and projecting how good these guys are going to be. And it's nice to see you put some data behind at least where they're going to go in the draft. So Benjamin, you mentioned this before in terms of the pandemic, how teams are reacting. Tell me a little bit more about like what you're seeing and how these mock drafts have shifted since all our lives have been changed. I mean, are draft positions more locked in than they have been in past years?
I don't know exactly. I haven't looked at that too much about, is draft position changing that much? Because to be honest, right now we're in this period where most of the big important events in the draft processes have already happened. We had the declarations, and obviously that changes because some players will drop out
Right.
and go back to school.
Right.
And then after that, we have the college all-star games. So, that's a little bit of a biased population because you're including seniors. And for the most part, most of the high-end draft prospects come out as juniors or redshirt sophomores. So we're just looking at the seniors. So the Senior Bowl helps identify a little bit more of some of the depth players that we're going to get drafted, as well as, I think more than anything else, the Senior Bowl specifically because of how prominent it is. And then after the Senior Bowl, we have the Combine. The Combine is an athletic check, where the thresholds have to be met by players. And if you don't have a good Combine, it can, in terms of the physical stuff, and then a little bit sometimes on the kind of psychological side. But I think that the Combine public data is more of a measure on what we see in terms of the physical stuff. So, for example, I did a blog post as well about this, about who benefits the most from a good performance at the Combine. And, I looked at 2 players in the case study, basically DK Metcalf, who got drafted by the Seahawks, and Orlando Brown, who got drafted by the Ravens. And these are 2 separate years of players. And you look at the data overall, how they kind of fit into the example is that, when you look at different measures of athleticism, I use this measure called relative athletic score. It basically just takes kind of the Combine measures and aggregates them and norms them per position and historical kind of information going back 20 plus years. And what we saw was that the people who benefited the most just in the kind of looking 2 weeks prior to 2 weeks after the combines are people who were athletic, very athletic, measured as elite athletic testers. But at the same time, if you were thought of as elite beforehand, it doesn't change as much because all we did is just confirm that you're elite. So, for example, Henry Ruggs this year, his position doesn't move all that much because he was already thought of as the second or third receiver beforehand, and they thought that because he was fast. All the combine did was prove that he was fast.
Right.
So the information this year that we're in this period now is this pro day period, which I'm not sure whether to believe anything I hear about pro day measures. Personally, I put about as much stock in those as I put in the media guide numbers you get from teams, because they'll say a player is 6'5", 200 some pounds, and then you see him, at the combine and he's 6'2", 190. And I know why teams do that for psychological purposes, and to kind of make their players bigger and stronger and faster. The Bruce Feldman freaks list that comes out in the summer. Some of those are true. Some of those I don't know.
Right.
So a lot of this stuff that's happening right now is probably a lot of hearsay.
Sure.
I'm not sure how much of the pro day information or these top 30 visits that aren't happening bias any of the results, or if everybody's paying attention to them. For the most part, it seems that every player meets with almost every team. And so some teams purposefully do that because they don't want other teams to think that they like a player and then will draft him anyway. It's kind of like, I don't really know what to make of that information. I don't think there's necessarily a lot of signal in it, and it varies quite a bit from player to player. And sometimes it means something and sometimes it doesn't. So ultimately, I think that it kind of ends up on the whole canceling itself out. But yeah, so that the pre-draft process, this horse race, I think that we're in this period right now where, there's definitely things happening inside of buildings. It's not public information. And so when I look at how much of the variation in actual draft position is explained by expected draft position, right now, just with this kind of very basic measure of central tendency, it's really only 80% or so of the variation that gets explained by expected draft position. So there's potentially, just on this very basic measure of central tendency, we have about 20% of variance that's not explained by expected draft position. And so I feel comfortable saying that some of that is some of this bias that we've injected into this process around them meeting individual players. And teams are still doing that. They're still meeting the individual players.
Sure.
They're doing a lot of FaceTime and Zoom or Skype or what have you. So they're still having those interactions, and biases can still come out of those interactions because people are biased, that we're all biased as humans. And so they're still making potentially biased interactions. There's something coming out of that. What I've heard mostly is that the biggest effect that this shutdown is going to have is on some of the players who come from smaller schools or, would have relied on a pro day because they didn't get a combine invite.
Right.
Or, anything along those lines. And those guys don't get full data. And so we know teams tend to be pretty risk averse. So potentially if they don't have data, they might just take somebody off their board.
Sure.
So there's something to be said that you might see fewer surprises this year. If that's the case, then you would think this draft would be more chalk. But I really don't know. I think there's still ways that bias can make its way into the process. But, we'll see what happens.
Benjamin, you have all this data on these mock drafts. Give us a surprising prediction for the 2020 NFL draft.
So I mentioned earlier that every year that I've looked at this, in the last 2 years, there's always been a player who was a first-round lock in my data who ended up not being in the first round.
Okay.
The big one, last year, there were two. DK Metcalf, who I thought was pretty much a slam dunk first round, had a mid-first round pick. The wide receiver from Ole Miss, who ended up getting drafted at the end of the second round. And then Jawan Taylor from Florida, who I thought was a top 10 pick, who ended up going in the top 10 of the second round to the team that people thought would draft him in the first round, which was the Jacksonville Jaguars. Okay. And a player this year that I'm kind of a little bit uncertain about when it comes to that I have a feeling about, not necessarily in the data, because in the data it shows that he's a kind of a strong mid-first round pick, is Justin Jefferson, one of those NFL caliber wide receivers that Joe Burrow threw to at LSU. And, the main reasoning that I think about that is that we really just don't see slot receivers get drafted high.
Interesting.
And so I think there's a chance that he might be overvalued because he has good traits and he has the production, but I'm not sure how much the league values a slot receiver. I really can't think of the last time that a pure kind of slot receiver ended up going in the first round. I mean, I think slot receivers can be pretty valuable. There could be, I think, potential market inefficiencies in having a player like, a Tyreek Hill who can be in the slot.
Right.
Henry Ruggs could also be in the slot, but I think that the league tends to value outside receivers quite a bit more. And you look at it in the dollars that get doled out to receivers in free agency and on the open market. You see that you don't necessarily see those big contracts for slot receivers unless they have the versatility to also play out wide. And so Jefferson, might end up going a bit later than I expect him to, which is kind of in the middle first round. He might go in the early second round because he's still really talented. But every year there's a player that I think is like a pretty strong lock who isn't. And, this year it's all every year in the first round, it's all a numbers game. It depends, if there's going to be a lot of offensive tackles in the first round. So there could be, anywhere from the top 4, there could be like 6 offensive tackles that go in the first round. And there's going to be 4 quarterbacks at least, maybe more. And so every time there's a position that kind of comes out of the woodwork that's unexpected, it pushes a player down. And wide receivers is supposed to be a really strong class. So maybe teams think, I can pass on drafting wide receiver now because there's still some really strong ones that I can get in the second round or in the third round. And so the teams that pick at the top of the second round will ideally have some players on their board who people thought were first-round players, but because of the way that the draft kind of unfurls, end up falling into a second-round consideration.
Awesome. Benjamin Robinson, thank you so much for joining me on the Football Analytics Show. Please tell everyone where they can find your work with mock drafts and where they can find you on Twitter.
So you can find my work at grindingthemocks.com. So that redirects to the web app that I've built that displays and visualizes all the data. And you can find me on Twitter at BENJ_Robinson.
Awesome. Thanks again for joining us. Thanks again for listening to that interview with Benjamin Robinson. I really do like his data. I looked at it last week and compared it to some of the betting markets on FanDuel Sportsbook. And they were very consistent. So, for example, you can bet on things like how many Alabama players will go in the first round of the 2020 NFL Draft. And it's very consistent with what Benjamin has on his site over at grindingthemocks.com. So please go check it out. If you're new to the Football Analytics Show and like what you hear, you can subscribe on Apple Podcasts. New episodes will automatically appear when they are released. Also, could I ask a favor? Can you leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts? This helps me spread the word about the show. You can subscribe and review by searching the Football Analytics Show on Apple Podcasts. When you find the podcast, click on it. You can subscribe by pressing the subscribe button. To leave a rating and review, scroll down past the first few episodes. Thank you very much. It means a lot to me. My name is Ed Fang, your host, and I'll see you again soon for another episode leading up to the 2020 NFL Draft.